Hi, this is Doug Draper. Thanks for joining us today on Uptime Logistics. It's powered by CAP Logistics. And again, I'm your host, Doug Draper with the Denver Transportation Club. Today's discussion is going to be awesome. It's incredibly timely, and we're excited to have an amazing speaker who I would also like to call a friend. We've had him on many times in different forms and fashions. It's Stefan Lessard. He's the Consul General from Canada here with us today, and he's actually joining us from Canada itself. So, Stefan, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Doug. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So the conversation today is related to the July 1st date of when the USMCA actually takes effect. So today's conversation is really about what does that mean? What does it mean for business? What does it mean for individuals? What does it mean for companies? So before we get into it, I wanted to ask Stefan just to kind of recap a little bit about what he does and the role of the consul here in Denver. And We'll start from the start. So, Stefan, give us a little background if you don't mind.
Of course. Well, thank you, Doug, for the invitation. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to rejoin the program to speak to your listeners. So, for the last 4 years, I've had the tremendous honor of being Consul General of Canada to Colorado and other states in the region. The Consul General is essentially like a mini ambassador. You know, we have the big shot, if you will, the ambassador of Canada to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman. She's in Washington, D.C. at the embassy, and she leads all aspects of everything that we do in the United States. But, you know, your country is big and it's wide and it's populated with tremendous vitality everywhere in the regions. So what we do is we have offices like the one that Canada has in Denver, and that's how we represent Canada in the region. So we work with the ambassador and her staff, but we are a little bit more connected to what's going on the ground in the various regions. So in our case, in Colorado, we have different programs. We have a team that does trade and investment, so promoting American investment into Canada, but also Canadian exports into Colorado and the region. And sometimes we help Colorado businesses looking to get started in Canada. We can provide some information. We have a public affairs program. We have a consular program where we help Canadians who run into some difficulties when they're traveling or otherwise living in the region. And we have also an administrative services team that helps us do what we do. So essentially, that's what we do. And the territory that I am active in is Colorado, Montana, Utah, Kansas, and Wyoming.
Excellent. Thanks for that recap. So one thing that's important, Stefan, is really understanding why is trade between the three nations important, right? That's critical as a baseline to understand as we go through this conversation. So maybe you could start there a little bit. That'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Doug. Yes, I think it's important to realize our people, our countries have always traded. We've traded for centuries, different commodities, agriculture, furs, lumber. Many commodities have been traded between us for even before Canada was the Canada that we know. But what has happened with NAFTA in particular is we have changed the way that we trade, and we've changed the way that we make things together. Before, we used to trade back and forth, and the things were made in the U.S. and shipped to Canada. But increasingly under NAFTA, we've changed the way we make things together so that the supply chains have become largely integrated. And that's different. Companies that are Canadian are established in the U.S., and they have intra-company trade, and that's true for American companies established in Canada as well. So there's intra-company trade, but also increasingly, Canadian companies will have suppliers from the U.S. And Mexico, and the same is true for U.S. companies procuring parts from Canada or Mexico, car companies, for example. And essentially, we make great things together now, and we provide them to each other and in our market to our consumers, but also we provide them to the rest of the world, and we outcompete other regions by making really great things, goods and services, and selling them to the rest of the world. And that has created a lot of prosperity. You know, Canada-US trade in 2019 was roughly $2 billion a day. Canada is the number one export market to the US. We buy more from the US as a country, Canada. We buy more US goods and services than China, Japan, and the UK combined. Mm-hmm. So Canada is really an important export market for Colorado and for the US. But we buy, and then, the US buys enormous lot from Canada as well. It's a fairly balanced trade partnership, and it works for everybody. It creates jobs and it creates prosperity for our communities.
Yeah, nice. Well, balanced and fair are key words, because when things change, right, whether it's an acronym or whether there's some differences, people are always looking for stability and certainty. Right, that's an important thing when anything changes. Talk about a little bit some of the stability and things that may not change, or things that will give our listeners confidence that that strong partnership that's been developed will maintain.
Well, yes. First of all, the USMCA is a continuation of NAFTA. So it builds on NAFTA, and it's really important to realize that the gains that we had achieved under NAFTA, for example, the tariff-free movement of most goods and services, that will continue under the USMCA. So, in that sense, we build on the achievements that we had. We did not walk them back. We are maintaining them, and it's really important to also realize that with the coming into force of the USMCA on July 1st, we will, going to your point about stability, we will have a new agreement in full legal force between the three countries, and that will maintain and reintroduce the stability, the predictability that our businesses require. In the process of renegotiating NAFTA to modernize it, there were some uncertainties about whether we actually would come up with a new agreement. And there were protectionist measures that were introduced and retaliation measures that were put in place. And investors and business people could legitimately say, are they going to make it to the finish line? Well, the good news is we did. On July 1st, the new agreement comes into force, and the first benefit from a Canadian perspective of the USMCA is that now we will have certainty, and that will be able to let our businesses, investors do what they do best, which is to create jobs, prosperity, to trade, and to invest where it makes sense, and we will all benefit from that.
So the auto industry is a great example, but I think it's also important to understand what would impact our listeners here in Colorado. And I know agriculture, beef production, and energy are critical for the relationship between Canada and Colorado specifically. Maybe talk a little bit about those three and how USMCA will help.
Yes, glad to. Well, first of all, Canada-Colorado trade is very large, and it's growing fast. Last year, in 2019, it was two-way trade was valued at $5.1 billion in two-way trade in goods alone, and that's growing year over year, which speaks again to the benefits of free trade between us. And it's true that agriculture is a big part of that. Energy trade is an enormous part of that. And also cattle and meat products are important. There are other sectors, but these three are very prominent. So in terms of what's new under the USMCA, I think the first one I would mention is under agriculture, there are some rules pertaining to grain trading. There was an irritant under NAFTA where some of the grain produced in the U.S. would be not evaluated quite the same way as Canadian grain for the purposes of the price that would be paid to the grain producers in the U.S. So that irritant, we call it grain grading. That issue was removed under the USMCA to the great satisfaction of everybody. But also, in particular on the dairy market, I have to say that Canada did make concessions to increase access for U.S. dairy producers to the Canadian market. We operate under a different regime in Canada. We have a system we call, we have a system where we match supply and demand between the suppliers and the producers, so that we guarantee reasonable prices for our producers of dairy, but also poultry and cheese and so on. And in the USMCA, there's an increase in the percentage of market access that was granted to U.S. producers of dairy products. Also, we have eliminated some irritants. There was a couple of what we call classes of dairy products, milk-based classes that were problematic for U.S. Dairy producers, and those are in the process of being eliminated. So in other words, slightly increased market access granted to U.S. producers, and also some irritants that were removed. In terms of cattle and meat products, nothing really has changed under the USMCA. Those were already tariff-free under NAFTA, and as we said, the gains of NAFTA were continued under the USMCA. And in terms of energy, energy trade was already tariff-free, so that hasn't changed. But there were some rules, more regulatory rules, that became hindrances to the ability of our companies to invest in each other's energy sectors, and those were streamlined so that it should be easier now for U.S. energy companies to invest in Canada and vice versa.
That's great. Well, we're here with Stefan Lessard. He's a Consul General, make sure I pronounce that correctly, of Colorado and the Rocky Mountain region. We appreciate all of his insight. So it's now July 2nd, right? It's not literally July 2nd, but let's say it's the day after the USMCA. And I don't want to say hunky-dory because that's not a technical term, but maybe the perception is everything is good to go and people go about their business. So is that really a true statement, or what are your thoughts? What happens now after the implementation?
Well, after the implementation, the work of the negotiators, the legislators, is done. People will have worked on a good new text. Is it perfect? No, but nothing is perfect. It's a negotiated text. It works for all three countries. And I think our negotiators and all the people working hard to produce the regulations and the rules will have done their work. But now it's up to our businesses, our investors, to do what they do best. Certainly to continue to create prosperity between our countries. But it's also important for policymakers to understand that the fact that we have an agreement that has the force of law doesn't guarantee that all those benefits will be generated necessarily, that it's important to continue to leave it to our businesses and investors, to leave them the freedom to do what they do. And here I'm referring, Doug, to the notion of protectionism, that their politicians and policymakers can be tempted on occasion to give preference to their manufacturers in their district or their state, whatever, because it may be good politics in some cases. And also, it's legitimate to have pride in the workers and pride in the products that are generated from our states, our district, our provinces. There are reasons why it's understandable that sometimes it feels like we should put protectionist measures in place, whether they're tariffs, whether there's regulatory measures like Buy America provisions, by Colorado, by Ontario, by Canada, and other measures like country of origin labeling for cattle and so on. These always proceed from this a genuine sense of desire to help our local industries. The problem with this is that they invite retaliation. So if Ontario decided to not buy anything from Colorado, I have a feeling that policymakers in Colorado would have views about that, and the same goes in reverse. So besides inviting retaliation, which then leads us to a downward spiral of protectionism. The thing that protectionist measures do inevitably, and this is time tested, is they raise the costs of doing business on the companies doing the business. For example, country of origin labeling forces cattle businesses and ranches and those people raising and the cattle and feeding the cattle and so on, and moving it across borders to keep track of where the cattle was at different times. And that requires equipment. It raises costs on the businesses. Those costs will be passed on to the meat producers and the processing plants, eventually to the consumer. So it makes our businesses less competitive. It acts as an inflationary pressure on the consumer and the businesses. It makes us less competitive. And so for those reasons, my word would be one of caution, that there are almost always unintended negative consequences of protectionism, whatever it is, tariff measures or regulatory measures, and that it's important to find solutions together, that sometimes irritants happen, we can work together and make it happen, that we find a reasonable solution. But the constant recourse to protectionist measures, often in the context of national security legislation, that is in fact, these are measures that will undermine the benefits of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA. Mm-hmm. And we have to be careful about that, because there's no point putting a free trade agreement if we don't allow free trade to operate.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And you've given some good perspective on what the USMCA can accomplish. And I appreciate your comments on protectionism and how that could be a downward spiral. Okay, so now you are a company here in Colorado doing business with Canada, and we're in the second half of 2020, and there's this new agreement, USMCA. What type of advice do you have for Colorado-based companies here as we enter the new agreement?
Well, I think it's a really exciting time, frankly, and I want to frame this in the context of the pandemic. I mean, the coming into force of USMCA is a big deal. It has all the benefits we've discussed, and it reintroduces certainty and predictability. So we should see it as a platform to continue to do and even enhance and ramp up what we were doing before, that is trading and investing. But in the context of the pandemic, I have to say, Canada, the US, and every country has been deeply impacted by the restrictions on business and the movement of people and so on and so forth. And I think that we should see also the USMCA as that springboard where we can benefit from the streamlined, the reduced regulations, the reduced costs, and the certainty, and really emphasize our efforts to grow that trade and enhance the investment. So how to do that practically? I think that US companies, Colorado companies, you have a lot of resources available. First of all, I would say that Canada is your natural export market. If you're not already exporting to Canada, I would suggest you consider Canada as your number one go-to first export market. We have relatively the same culture. notwithstanding my accent,
Yeah.
There's a whole lot that we have built together, this continent that we have, and we have legal systems that are extremely similar, and the infrastructure and energy and the auto route system and everything is so integrated. Our economies are deeply integrated, so Canada is your natural first export market or your expansion market if you're already in trading with Canada. The way to do that is, first of all, to realize that Canada is not one single export market. It's multiple markets, just like the US is multiple markets for a foreign company, a Canadian one or whatever. There's a lot of natural trade corridors, north-south, between Canada and the US. And it's easy for a Colorado company maybe to trade with Alberta because it's so similar, the culture and so on. But other provinces are also different markets, and they should be examined too, including Quebec, where my mother tongue, French, is spoken. Different rules apply sometimes on advertising and things like that. So we are here, we are there to help US companies who can know a little bit more about the Canadian market. I would say that the first thing to do is to do your homework, to realize that there are diversities and different consumer needs in Canada, and to really study your regional markets of interest. You can speak to the US Commercial Service, people like Paul Bergman in Colorado that are able, with their team, to advise US companies on accessing the Canadian market. What we do in our office is we more support Canadian companies accessing the US market, but we're always open to a good conversation. And, I think study the market, look to the US Commercial Service, give us a call. We have a trade and investment team that is crackerjack. And if you give us a call, we have an office on Broadway in Denver. We can steer you in the right direction. And if you do your homework and you are willing to make the investment of time and possibly some money to get settled in the supply chains with Canadian partners, get settled perhaps with a footprint in Canada so you can serve the regional market. It's a market of 36 million people, very similar with some differences to the US market. And I think you will do really well in Canada.
We'll be sure to have the contact information at our link whenever we post the show here, so our folks will know how to get in touch with your group. It's much appreciated. So I wanted to end the discussion here today and have our audience learn about some changes that will be going on in your life related to your role here in Colorado. So maybe it's breaking news we could put on the bottom of the screen, but maybe you'd like to tell everybody what's going on and go from there.
Sure. I never thought I'd be on breaking news. Usually that's bad news for people like me.
That's true. This is good news, good breaking news.
This is good news. Well, in a way, it's a transition. So I have had the enormous honor and pleasure to be Consul General of Canada to Colorado for the last 4 years. But my term as Consul General is ending in mid-August. So I still have good things to do with the team and good discussions to have to move our work forward with all our Colorado friends. However, there will be a successor that will come behind me very soon. I don't quite know who at this time, but that will be announced shortly, I'm sure. And for me, the transition will be back to Canada, where I will continue to work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We call it Global Affairs Canada. And on to other good things, I am sure. I want to say that I will never forget the tremendous privilege of being Consul General to Colorado and the region. It's been the honor of my life working with so many businesses, so many partners, working with you, Doug, and the team, Keenan, and others, working with companies like Cap Logistics, but so many more, to do good things, to grow prosperity in our communities and jobs, and strengthen the links between Canada and Colorado in so many ways. It's been an enormous pleasure. And I will take all of those memories back with me to Canada. And the good news is the friendships last, and I will certainly be back in Colorado as the first opportunity.
That's great. Well, I think you nailed it that friendships last. And we can't thank you enough for being a friend with the program, Uptime Logistics, the Cap Logistics family, and whoever follows you is going to have some pretty big shoes to fill. So you've been tremendous, and I want to personally thank you. It's been great. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today on Uptime Logistics. Of course, that's powered by Cap Logistics. You can find more information about the show in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And obviously, visit caplogistics.com for all your customized transportation solutions. Thanks again.